What happens to a fantasy story if you take the stakes way, way down? What if instead of a villain who wants to destroy the world, you have the pushy salesman from The Office?
But you have to decide for yourself. I mean, these guys gonna take care of your things if you die tomorrow?
So I read Legends Lattes, and the one question that I wanted answered going into this was, is this massively successful book really a great huge step forward for low stakes or cozy fantasy, or is it just boring, you know? Can you replace a drastic lack of stakes with just wholesomeness, and does that work? And does it belong in fantasy? What's shaking? My name's Cam, welcome back to another video. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, and I've made lots of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, then I would love it if you stuck around. So this video will be two discussions. The first will be about Legends Lattes. I'll talk about the story and a surprising way that it made me feel, kind of a feeling that I haven't really gotten from any other fantasy books ever. And then the second discussion will be about cozy fantasy in general, low stakes fantasy in general, and how I feel about cozy fantasy as the next big thing. Legends Lattes by Travis Baldree is a self-described low-stakes fantasy about an orc who retires from a life of, fighting and being a warrior to open a cafe, essentially. After reading the book, I can tell you, that's quite literally what it is. In regards to the story, there really isn't much more to tell you. Normally in my book reviews, I would be giving a bit of a summary about the story and then tiptoeing my way around spoilers. But in this case, I really don't think there's anything I could tell you that would classify as a spoiler. And I know that sounds like a bad thing, but just bear with me. So the story actually opens with the tail end of like a bloody battle, and from there we jump straight to what I would say is like the book equivalent of side quests. As our main character, her name's Viv, she starts setting up her own coffee shop. So imagine it like you're playing a game and you have to go around and gather the crafting materials to make resources that you would use to build, I don't know, your home or something like that. That's kind of what this story started with. As the story progresses, there is an element of danger in the plot in the form of what is essentially a group making all of the shops in this area pay them protection money, or else,
Maybe you can use supplemental coverage of some kind. Anybody can get hurt. You always think it can't happen to you,
and of course, Viv, being a battle-hardened orc, isn't really cool with that. That's where the only real element of conflict or danger comes into it. However, that is really just a B plot, to the A plot being Viv and her succubus co-owner trying to come up with ideas and ways to improve the cafe and make it more successful. The evolution of the coffee shop and its success is the meat of the story, which feels like a really weird thing to say about a fantasy book, but again, bear with me. There is also a little romance plotline, but to be honest, I didn't find it too important or noteworthy or special, so nah. But did I like Legends Lattes? The short answer is, yeah. I actually did, surprisingly. It's really cozy, it's wholesome, and it was really comforting to read as well. However, this isn't the type of storytelling that I think I could do more than once in a blue moon. I doubt I'll be thinking about the story of Legends Lattes come next week, but I am glad that I read it. What I will say is that it's definitely not going to work for all fantasy fans. If you're someone who needs a bit of action or like excitement in your stories, this probably won't be the one for you. I'm gonna make a few comparisons, and they're going to get weirder as I go, but give me a chance. Reading Legends Lattes is a lot like watching an episode of a show that you've watched a million times while you eat your dinner. I'm sure lots of us do that. Then once you're done eating, you switch it off and you watch something else. Legends Lattes is the comfort dinner show of books for me. There's a certain kind of feeling that I got from reading Legends Lattes that I think could only really come from cozy fantasy like this. It'll be really hard to explain that feeling, but I'm gonna give it a go. My interest in this story was seeing how the coffee shop would improve, what upgrades it would get, how it would evolve. Every time they added something new, like for example a ratkin named Thimble that would make pastries, or a bard that would play music and end up becoming the fantasy version of / every time something like that happened, it was a tangible upgrade to the cafe. It was very easy to understand that this thing happened. For example, they hired a bard, therefore the cafe is better than it was before that thing happened. It was a tangible upgrade. As we progress through the story, we see these upgrades, and the feeling it gave me felt a lot like the feeling I get when I'm playing a sandbox game and I make an upgrade to my house or my farm or whatever. For example, I'll be playing Stardew Valley and I upgrade from the watering can to the sprinklers. When I do that, there is a feeling of accomplishment, satisfaction in how much better it is or more efficient it is, and more importantly, excitement for what the next upgrade will be. What am I going to work towards next? How is that going to make my farm look? That feeling right there is the feeling that I got with Legends and Lattes, and that is a really weird feeling to have when you're reading a fantasy book, but somehow it worked. It was fun. I hope that makes sense. A lot of this is Travis's ability to tell a story, in particular a cozy fantasy story. I think he's obviously quite good at it. What I've described might sound like a very easy kind of fantasy to write, but I can assure you it's not. There is a very fine line between comfort and boredom, and you have to have a bit of talent or skill to do that. I don't think I could do cozy fantasy personally, because if I try to go more than 2 chapters without someone getting, punched or stabbed, I'm gonna get a knot in my stomach. In one of my last videos, I looked at 1-star reviews for Legends and Lattes, and one of them said that there was no point in this being a fantasy, or something like that. It basically said that aside from there being a few fantasy characters, it really wasn't a fantasy in any other sense. And that raised a really interesting question for me, because if all of the characters in Legends and Lattes were human, and there was no magic or fantasy stuff, could you tell the exact same story? Personally, I think, yeah, you could. And normally that wouldn't be a good justification for this story being a fantasy at all. However, there being fantasy characters and, a little bit of magic, that kind of stuff, is a huge part of what made this story so charming. Viv being an orc is a great part of her character. She could have just been a huge muscular woman and been just as physically imposing and served the same purpose in the story. However, her being an orc adds a very unique element to her as a character. It helps to imbue her personality of being reserved and a little bit aggressive with a lot more depth. So there's a good segue into a short discussion on cozy fantasy as a whole. So with Legends and Lattes exploding into popularity, it's gotten a lot of people talking about the possible surge of cozy fantasy and low stakes fantasy. That's generally how book trends start. Something will rise to popularity, something a little bit fresh and new, and then a lot of people will try to replicate that success, and some will succeed and some will fail, and it'll catch on, etc., etc. So I certainly think it's possible, in fact, even likely, that we're about to see a lot more cozy and low-stakes fantasy. At the very least, Legends and Lattes has proven to publishers that you don't need an epic 500-page story about gods threatening to destroy the world for readers to open their wallets, which is great. While cozy fantasy specifically isn't really at the top of my list when it comes to favorite fantasy subgenres, I do put low stakes fantasy pretty high up there. Maybe not stakes as low as my cafe might not get customers, but low stakes stuff like someone rescuing someone that they love rather than rescuing the whole world. Or low stakes fantasy in regards to more episodic stories, self-contained adventures or quests where they tackle small problem after small problem and then maybe a big problem that ties all of those smaller ones together. For example, The Witcher or Dresden Files. I know I talk about episodic fantasy on here a lot, so I won't go into it too much, but I do think it's a criminally underrated way to tell fantasy stories. I like cozy, comforting stories, and I really do think there is a place for it in fantasy. I don't see myself reading more than maybe one of these books every few months, but I can see the appeal for sure. And I am pretty much 100% convinced that we're about to see a lot more cozy fantasy coming out in the next few years. These type of books are a really great palate cleanser. Say you're burned out from reading a 500,000-word Brandon Sanderson novel, you could kick your feet up and read a story about a gnome that wants to open a casino or something like that. It's kind of like side quests in a game, or like reading about one of the background characters from an epic fantasy book. Maybe the Chosen One is off fighting the Dark Lord somewhere, and instead we are reading about the shopkeeper. The shopkeeper deciding if they should give a discount to the cute dwarf chick with the fat ass. I'm excited to see if this wave of low-stakes fantasy turns into a tsunami, or if it fades out on the shore, because anything new that can keep things fresh and shake up the trends within, the fantasy community is great. I think it's fantastic. But what do you think? Have you read Legends and Lattes? Did you like it, or did you find it boring? Or how do you feel about low-stakes fantasy in general? Speaking of episodic low-stakes fantasy, I wrote one myself. It's called Blood for Coins. It's the first book in a fantasy series that will be shorter and more episodic, about two sellswords who will do pretty much anything for money. But the problem is, in this first book, Blood for Coins, one of them is locked away in the world's most dangerous prison. That comes out at the end of this week as ebook, paperback, and audiobook, which is very exciting. So keep an eye out, but I will be making a video about that as well on the day. Thank you for watching, especially for watching through the whole video. You are my favorite. I make lots of videos about fantasy books, so if that's your kind of thing, I would love it if you stuck around. Otherwise, maybe I'll see you in the next one. Catch ya.